turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah. First, thanks for taking time. I mean, you are faculty, you're not getting credit. So I am personally thankful and honored to have your attention. This is going to be a conversation. I have the microphone, but that doesn't mean you can't talk loudly and participate. And it's going to be a conversation about the subject, what makes science hard? And that, I very often ask questions that are perceived to be very simple-minded. I mean, the obvious answer from scientists, I'm married to one, so I know how they think, is science is hard because it's hard. Haven't you heard that? And it takes hard work, it takes brains, it takes commitment, it takes focus on both the big picture and the detail, and not everybody is capable of learning science. Well, that's a view. It's a view that at its most perverse was expressed on a university campus, not this one, when word got out that the students considered computer science the hardest course in that particular university, at which point the chairman of physics said, we'll have to change that, I mean, in a very threatening voice. So the game is, it's hard because it's hard, and that, of course, makes me, meaning you, who have mastered this subject, very special. And not everybody in the class is likely to be very special, and maybe one of my purposes in offering a class to a large number of students is to figure out who's special and who isn't. So I want to start by inviting you to look at a handout, the last 2 pages, which I can take some credit for assessing and analyzing. And the first, we need more?
I had some papers to share.
I see. I was told to bring 30. Oh, well, yeah, it would be good then. Well, for those who want to share, just have a look at this picture. It's just a drawing. It's a concept. Do you not have any here? Oh, you're okay. And this is my rendering of how a typical first-year professor in the physical sciences, which is what I've really studied in depth, thinks about the students in front of him or her, that there are really 2 populations. One, a very large population, I have dubbed them, meaning people not like me, and then a very small group of students who tend to sit up near the front, have their hands raised, give the kind of answers, even when they're the wrong answers, the kind of answers that the professor used to give himself or herself, and whom the professor can identify with as sort of us. And while there's always room for a member of the them to gravitate to the us by writing a surprisingly good exam or asking a profound question, it's presumed that at the end of the class, the thems and the us's are going to be about who they were at the beginning. Now, this isn't necessarily conscious, but it is observable that there are students who raise their hand, ask a question. You can tell by the smile on the professor's face. This is just the kind of question I would have asked myself or I enjoy answering. Another one will ask a question that is either off the wall or not part of the syllabus. You know, why is the sky blue? You know, we'll get to that in chapter 16. But nothing that really tracks, if I can use that verb, tracks with what the professor is about. There's another picture, and it's my own contribution to the subject, the second sheet here, which is an improvement, I think, a more precise rendering of what that classroom is made up of. And here we have the them and the us broken out in a more precise way, in my view. So the people just like me, I call the first year. And I continue to believe it's a small number of students in the class, even in an engineering school, where people have come because they are oriented towards science and mathematics. Still, only a small proportion will be very similar to the professor. Just outside, a group I have creatively named the second tier. And I define the second tier operationally as people, frankly, like myself, or actually like Victor, who started out in history. I studied political science. We are, I believe, capable of learning science, physical science, doing fairly well, but we come at the subject differently than the professor did in his or her youth. We come at it with some big questions. We do want to know why the sky is blue. We also want to know what the nature of the atomic weapon was and why America was able to get a leg up on Germany in developing the atomic weapon, what the issues are around nuclear power. We want to know those sometime during the course, not necessarily on the first day, but this step-by-step building of a structure of understanding of chemistry or physics is a little tedious for us. We're capable of it, but it's a little tedious. And what I spent a lot of my research on, a book that's not here because it's so widely known, it's called They're Not Dumb, They're Different, was a very close study of the second tier. Essentially, I hired graduate students in philosophy and literature, history, political science, who had no math anxiety. They had done calculus somewhere along the way, but they were not ready as undergraduates to take physics or chemistry, any kind of physics or chemistry. They took something for non-majors. Now they were in graduate school in philosophy and history and classics, doing very well, and they appreciated a $1,000 honorarium, which I was able to give them, in exchange for which they studied, as if they were students, an intro physics or an intro chemistry course in several universities. And my advice to them, my demand of them for the $1,000 was that they do all the work that was required of the students taking the course for credit, including labs, including exams, including finals and the whole thing, and lab reports, and all the while keep a journal record of how they were finding the delivery system, not just the material, although they wrote, of course, about the material, but also the delivery system, what was expected of students, what kind of assignments they got, what the textbook was like to someone who hadn't really read a physics or chemistry textbook before, and to write comments about it. And their comments constituted a book I call They're Not Dumb, They're Different, and they were very profound. First, to the surprise of everyone, they did outstandingly well. Once they got the hang of the game, once they understood what they had to prepare for on exams, they took them and did very well, but they were not without criticism of the exams, for example. They said the exams were missing the important big picture, that the exams were tedious to study for and tedious to take, that they didn't enjoy their exams, whereas they had remembered enjoying exams in their other fields. You may smirk and you may say, well, of course, what do you expect? On the other hand, part of our job as educators is to excite and engage and reward and enjoy them, and they get them to enjoy our subject, and that was not working. They commented negatively about the delivery system. I think most creatively, one of them said, I got interested in, we were taught Avogadro's number early on because we had to go to the lab and we had to do some measuring. And then I found that Avogadro's insight was buried in a caption under a picture in the textbook. And far more exciting for me was Avogadro's insight, that somewhere in the 17th century somebody could anticipate that there would be a constant that would explain, the molecular theories. That was more exciting for me, but what the teacher focused on was 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd, the number. They found that they were being asked to be obedient and not creative. Now, a lot of professors would say creative in a science class. I mean, how can you be creative? You're not at the Nobel lesson. But they wanted some experience of creativity, experience of discovery, and they weren't having that. So one of them coined a phrase. She said in her assessment that went into the book, my IQ enabled me to do physics. It was sufficient. But my OQ, she made up this term, my obedience quotient was too low. That's very profound. I mean, these are smart people. They're in graduate school. They've had real success as undergraduates, and they didn't really want to only sort of practice their obedience capacity. They wanted to do more thinking on their own. There's a limit to how far you can go in accommodating the second tier, but the point of that book was to get faculty to at least pay attention. The next tier out there, which I creatively call the utilitarians, represent actually the largest portion, as far as we can tell, of students in the physical sciences in the first year course. They are in there for some utility, some purpose, either nursing or engineering. They have to take it, they need to take it, they want to take it because they want to become fluent in the subject of science, but they are not interested in the big picture or the creativity. They are very different from the second tier, and they are very different from the first tier. So what we're facing already, before we get to the end of this, is three very disparate populations, all sitting in a single course, all reading the textbook, all having to take a common exam, who are extremely different one from another. And you could well ask me, how does one possibly accommodate them all? And our observation is that they aren't accommodated except for the first tier. That the course is taught the way it was taught to the teacher who's teaching it and who was taught in terms of the academic grandfather, and that it's not really a priority to reach everybody else. Then we have another tier, especially in our public universities, called the underprepared. They may be able intellectually to do the work, but they have had very little experience in laboratories because they went to high schools that were not really very well equipped. And so their laboratory skills, their hand-holding skills are lower. They may have had inadequate mathematics, and it's presumed, of course, in physics that you know enough calculus to be able to use trigonometric functions or at least calculus to solve physics problems. And even though there may be a room on campus to help them with developmental math, still they are very different from the utilitarians who can manage the science, from the second tier who can want more than what's demanded, and from the first year. And outside, I have had to concede over time, interviewing students and faculty, that there are folks out there who are just unlikely. They are hostile to science because they really do blame science for the atomic bomb. They have, strong prejudices against science or scientists, or they are just, they've never encountered a scientific insight that excited them. And so they are going to come in and go out sort of unchanged. With that picture, if you would accept it, if not as an exact rendering of your class, that there is a possibility that there are students in the class who fit these categories, the question then is, how do you deal with them? Is it an anxiety issue? I'll start by telling you why I don't think it is. Or is it what kind of an issue is it? How do you package science so that it is useful, usable, and enjoyable to a wider variety of students? So now I wanted to just step back and tell you how I got into science. I started in mathematics with the issue of anxiety in math, which was particularly prevalent among girls, although not unknown in boys. And a friend of mine in physics at Loyola thought that the model worked equally for science. Our model was we took people who were too anxious about math to take a class. We took them outside the class, put them in a setting where they could be very honest and very frank about their feelings, and we worked through the whole experience they had in elementary school, sort of psychologically, and helped them gain control over those feelings, those emotions that were getting in their way. And my friend at Loyola thought that there was a comparable situation in science, so he picked up math anxiety as a concept, and he wrote a book about science anxiety. And because we're friends, he said, I'd like you to write a preface to this book, an introduction, an endorsement. Well, what are friends for? You're supposed to do that. I read it, and I suddenly saw something that I hadn't really understood before, that it isn't the same problem in science, and here's why. When we did the math anxiety work, we heard from the math anxious, the most severely math anxious, about trauma in elementary school. having to go to the blackboard, I guess that was a whiteboard, in front, turn your back to the enemy, as they told us, and do some sort of calculation or display, and in front of everybody make mistakes. They had time test anxiety. One of them said she continued to look at the clock during a test when she was in fourth grade, and the only thing she ever really learned was short division and subtraction. She would subtract the minutes left and divide by the number of problems left. She was very good at that. And throw down her pen. It was hopeless. There was no way she could finish. And they had more, they were just stressed out as young children by math. Science in the elementary schools is fun. Who's ever stressed out by science in elementary school? I mean, you've got fast plant growing, you've got an aquarium, you've got things to touch and feel and poke, and even the exams are not so strict or stringent, at least not in this country. In China, they're teaching chemistry, physics, and biology in separate classes from fourth grade on, but we don't do that. So I asked myself as I read Jeffrey's book, if it's not an anxiety rooted in the early years when children are particularly helpless and helpless to cope, what then does make science difficult and off-putting? It has to be a different answer to that question. And so I wrote him the introduction, that's what friends before, but I then proceeded to look at science and began to investigate and decided that the way to find out what makes science hard is to do what you scientists do when you have an experiment. What's the design of an experiment? You remove all variables but one. I mean, isn't that what you do? And then you can make a judgment as to what happens. Okay, in the learning of science process, there are many variables. One of them obviously is intelligence. The other is willingness to work hard. And the third is confidence in one's ability to learn, all of those. And then there's, of course, if you're a freshman, newness to the field. As smart as you are, confident as you are, accomplished as you are, frankly, the first time you see waves in elastic media and somebody tries to tell you how to think about it, it's the first time. So I determined that I would do an experiment that removed all the variables in the equation except newness to the field. Now, how do you do that? You engage a group of students who are equal in intelligence, equal in motivation, equal in self-discipline, equal in ability to learn to the professor. And who are those people on a campus? The faculty in English and history and music, right? Just as smart, just as motivated, just as determined, just very good learners, but totally unaware of what waves and elastic media is all about. And I conducted a series of short experiments around the country with a very warm cooperation of faculty, where we would choose an excellent teacher, because we didn't want that messing things up, one of the prize-winning teachers in physics or chemistry or mathematics, ask that person to teach a lesson, a single lesson that didn't presume prior knowledge, but was essential to the subject. So waves in elastic media was one, entropy in chemistry was another, diminishing differences in mathematics. We let the faculty member choose a topic. And then we collected learners from the faculty from the other sides of the campus. So they were sitting in a learning situation. It could have been like this room. And a presentation was made, complete with demonstrations, just the way it would be taught to a group of undergraduates. And I instructed the outside learners to draw a line down the middle of the page, and on one side of the page to take the kind of notes they would take if they really needed to learn it for an exam. On the other side, to keep a record of questions or issues that came up, which might have to do with vocabulary. I mean, they were extremely fluent people in terms of their English mastery, but the vocabularies of science are very specific, and they might not have, they might have had trouble with them. In any case, out of the left-hand side of the page, after we completed the lecture, 50-minute lecture, we broke a little coffee, they came back, and they read out loud, basically, under my sort of conducting from the left-hand side of the page. And the professor was still there, and in the third tier of this room were faculty from the professor's department. So the other chemistry teachers were there and the other physics teachers were there. And they were listening, and really for the first time in their careers, to extremely fluent, extremely sensitive, extremely intelligent learners, surrogate learners, talk about what they didn't understand in the lecture that had just been completed. And it was a source of real insight for the professors. I wrote some articles about what I learned, and then it struck me, people commented, that's all very well for the lecture system. What about going to lab? What about taking exams? What about the whole course? And that caused me to get some funding so I could hire graduate students who could actually take an entire semester-long course as outsiders, the same principle, outsiders using their experience as learners to comment and to critique. And I have to say that book, They're Not Dumb, They're Different, I think there were 50,000 distributed, and I got letters from faculty for years thanking me because they said that they had never heard in language that was really sophisticated how what they were doing appeared to a very intelligent, motivated learner who was just not a younger version of themselves. So by my definition, the faculty outside of the sciences of mathematics are second tier, not lower, just a little bit outside of the insider speech and the insider views. And I use that to help other people, really want to do things differently. So let me just go over with this. You have copies of this now. Some of the issues that came up from these experiments about which I've written in other books, and I'd like to engage you in a conversation about. There's a handout, yeah. So I've told you why the math anxiety doesn't fit. Then the tier analysis. One of the many comments of our outside learners is, why are there three sciences? There's only one nature. Now, somebody who chose chemistry at age 15 might say, what kind of a question is that? Chemistry is the central science or the most interesting science. But it deserves a comment, at least, or a perspective that there is only one nature, and we have invented three sets of inquiries with their own rules of the road to penetrate some of the secrets of nature. So it would behoove us all, this is a recommendation, that you start this class with some big general observation about the field. What it is that chemistry finds out or penetrates, or what kind of questions chemistry asks that the other sciences do not. And what is it that makes chemistry so central? That what is going on at the level of whatever goes on in our bodies, protein formation, and at the level of geology right out here, is chemistry. And the difference is time, right? But it's a reaction. Am I wrong? There's a chemical reaction, and the reaction has some commonalities, and the difference, of course, is time. These are the kind of bigger questions that set the science in its place. Even a little bit of history. Why physics is both old and new. Aristotelian physics obtained for a very long time, and why Newtonian physics came about when it did, and how potent it is. I think we are all in awe of science and its achievements. But the variations, how a biologist approaches nature, what counts, what doesn't count, how a chemist approaches nature, how a physicist, is worth time. It's the sort of thing that would engage the second tier students, make them, motivate them. There are different vocabularies in the sciences. This book, which I wrote with my physicist husband, so that I had a little backup, has a whole chapter on the vocabularies of science. Because on the surface, words are words are words, right? And you have to learn the words, and we test them by their recognition ability of words. But the languages, the words, the type of language used in biology is very different from that in chemistry, and certainly very different from that in physics. Every physicist will tell you that you can't look up mass or force in the dictionary and get very far. That you have to have an operational definition of the languages you use in physics. And that wouldn't be true of biology. Biology is a naming science. You learn as many new words in intro biology, I'm told, as you do in intro German. As many new words, because every one of these organelles and little items, objects has to be named. So what we did in the chapter on the vocabularies was to try to instruct students as to how to approach these vocabularies. Every class is going to expect you to be able to talk in the language of that science. And every one of those languages is new to you if you're 18 years old and you haven't had very much science. But understanding how vocabulary is employed in a particular science is worth class time. How mathematics is used in the sciences turns out to be another big issue for outsiders coming in and even insiders trying to get ahead. Everybody says you need math to do engineering, you need math to do physics, you actually need math to do algebra to do chemistry. But how is mathematics used in the sciences? And we had a whole chapter here on the uses of mathematics in science. And one of them is simply modeling, not solving equations, but modeling. Mathematics turns out to be extremely useful and usable in modeling. Where did calculus come from? You know, it came from an effort to understand change, right? I mean, it was invented by 3 different people in the same year or the same range of years, Leibniz and Descartes and Newton. And it was invented to solve problems that are very important, very necessary. So it's not as if you take math because they tell you to take math. The science teacher has to point out in the bigger picture how essential math is to doing science then and doing science now. And one of them is modeling and introducing young people to the power of modeling nature on a 2-dimensional sheet of paper. I mean, that's phenomenal if you stop and think about it. Phenomenal. It makes Kodak look like a latecomer. So it's partly to get the awe and use the awe productively. You know, we don't want them so in awe that they are intimidated. That would be going in the opposite direction. But in awe so that they are motivated. That's how awe should be used, to motivate. I mentioned the IQ versus OQ critique. So some ways of dealing with OQ problems, obedience quotient. The testing was a big issue among my second tier. They found the test, they aced them. One of our students didn't do all that well, the one Fuller selected, but everybody else was as good as anybody in the class, and several of my instructors said afterwards, I weep that this person is not going to be a physics major. I mean, this is a loss to physics. This is a loss to chemistry. That's what happens when very motivated, smart people wrap their minds around a subject that they had disdained before. So what about the test? Well, the test. They were the least enjoyed part of the course, and not because they did poorly. They aced the test. The first response was, I studied all the wrong things because they were preparing to study for history or philosophy. They were looking for essentials, for generalizations, for the heart of the subject, and what was being asked for was a little bit of the homework assignment, you know, done over again. So I know enough, married to a scientist, that there's no way we're going to get rid of, you know, the equations and solving for or explaining, you know, the pressure ratio. But there are ways maybe of varying the question formats. At Purdue, they have tried, independent of my pressure on their own, to make some of the chemistry tests more pictorial, less like applied algebra. And they've done that very creatively, where they ask the formulaic question, but then they show 4 pictures of some sort of a space with some pressure and, you know, air going in or out, and ask which of these 4 pictures best corresponds to the situation described in the problem. What they find is that they pick up some students doing very well on the pictorial rendering who were not doing all that well in the applied algebra. That's important. You don't want to lose them. They've got a feeling for chemistry, a sort of visual comprehension. After all, chemistry is visual. And they are, they could be good chemistry students, but you may have to accommodate them a little more. For the second tier, what they wanted were bigger thought questions. So I borrowed one from history, what on the other side of the campus we do a lot of to stimulate students' creativity. So here's a question that you might have not thought of. If Columbus hadn't discovered the New World, in 1492, when and under whose flag would it have been discovered? First thing you notice is there's no one right answer. But there are lots of wrong answers. I mean, it wouldn't have been Poland. And the reasons are partly Poland's location. It's not on the Atlantic. It's also where Poland was in its capacity for seafaring, its development of, navigational aids. So I don't want to answer the question for you, but you can see that a certain kind of student finds that kind of question intriguing. And what we really want to do is bring that kind of student into the class, into the success, into the major. Not necessarily all of them, but you don't want to miss them because they're very often the people who stand outside, ask a new question, and get Nobel Prizes. You know that. I know that. They're not the ordinary. I'm just rereading a book about Barbara McClintock because the 20th anniversary of her Nobel Prize is this year. She got it in 83. And she was just a loner for a while. In the beginning, she was in the mainstream. And then she went off, about jumping genes. Anybody here in biology? Yeah, jumping genes. And she was made fun of and all of that, but she stuck with it, and she had how she supported herself. And then, fortunately, lived long enough, because they don't give Nobel Prizes to dead people. And in her early 80s, she was born in 2002, and she got the award in 83. She was awarded the Nobel Prize. And I know 2 or 3 Nobel Prize winners who will say, as historically people say, it was from asking a different question or standing in a different space or reading something somebody did that failed that made me wonder why it failed. I mean, this isn't your ordinary step-by-step. These are people with wide-ranging minds. Rolf Hoffman, for those who know chemistry, molecular orbitals. I mean, what he does for fun is poetry. He's a published poet. And he's very, very molecular. He wrote I don't know if a poem or a book about molecular beauty. He's very visual, extremely visual, and does all his chemical thinking visually, and is just, different from everybody else. So we don't want to cut those people out. And even if they don't become Nobelists, they're going to be members of Congress or members of the state legislature, and somebody's going to come up with a plan to increase the chemistry department at Montana Tech. And somebody is going to be making a judgment, a vote, based on that person's undergraduate experience in chemistry. And a lot of the people we've interviewed who are out there in power positions say, I learned 3 things from my introductory physics course, a physics study. One was that I'm not very good at it. Now, that's really a nice lesson to take back. Number 2, it's really not interesting. And number 3, it's not important. And now they're on the NSF funding, oversight committee, and their experience with physics was pretty, negative. It's not smart. So what else we can do with the exams is the grading practices. People think grading on a curve is optimum. I don't want to get into that, argument, but the grading on a curve does really incite a lot of competition. And Dudley Hirschbach, another Nobelist, told me what he did in his class. He taught, I think, not Chem 20. Is he an inorganic chemist or an organic chemist? He's a physical chemist. Okay, it was Chem something else, not Chem 20. And he found that students all competing and very stressed out over exams at Harvard. They're all trying to get to medical school or whatever. So he invented 2 innovations in grading practice. I'm now not talking about the content of the exam, just grading practice. The first was he announced he wasn't grading on a curve. He was hoping, it being Harvard, that all of his students would be A students. There was nothing to keep them from being A students. He wasn't going to make it possible for a 90, to be at the bottom. And the second thing he did, which was even more creative, was he invented resurrection points. He said if you missed a question on, say, heaps of formation on the hour exam in November, but on the mid-year in January, you got a heaps of formation question right. Why should he, the teacher, carry this negative point forward when you know it? Some of this stuff is so obvious. So he enabled students to petition for a resurrection point, but they didn't have to do it themselves. The grader did. That the grader would have a list of all the failed question topics from the hour exam or two, and then at the final, when they calculated the final grade, they gave back the lost credit from November. And there were two kinds of students who objected, he tells this story. One were Catholic students who thought it was an abuse of the term resurrection. You can't please everybody. And the other were pre-meds who thought it was unfair that this person sitting in the next seat who missed heaps of formation in November should get the same grade in January. They were so competitive. Well, Dudley says, and I'm quoting Dudley, the one advantage of the Nobel Prize is you don't have to pay any attention to pre-med. That's personal to me. So, and the icing on the cake is what I call it, that's what our second tier in particular, but I think all of the students really want. Icing on the cake is the payoff for having learned all this stuff. And where's the icing on the cake? It's in the application. I would, if I were teaching science, bring into class the Tuesday New York Times. Somebody's going to have to pay for the subscription because it shows applications, too much on health for my taste. But there is a fair amount on astronomy and physics and what's happening, and it's in language that lay people can understand. It's as good as any, and it's hot news. It's what's happened, in the last few months. And just distributing that on a Friday afternoon, so you miss, one more little mini lesson, but you say, let's now talk about something that appeared having to do with chemistry in last week's New York Times, and it engages them, tells them this is important, this is current, and this will be useful to me. Then my third and last topic is making change at the department level. Not all of this can be done. In fact, almost none of this can be done by a single professor in a single classroom, especially an untenured professor, without the corroboration and support of the department and even more of the college. If you're going to skip a chapter, say, heaven forbid, skip a chapter because you want to deal with applications or something in the history of science, you're going to have to get support from the department chair. If it's a department-wide exam, you're going to have to get some kind of exemption. Otherwise, your students are, punished. And that has to be one of the goals of the department is to increase the majors, increase the success rate. That's a goal. Increase the success rate of the students. When students don't succeed, it's not entirely their fault. We're like doctors. If we haven't diagnosed the problem, we're leaving them to themselves. So what the department can do is approve or at least condone or at least enable a change in exams. The whole grading issue is sometimes made by the senior faculty and updating labs and lab reporting. So this is what I came to talk to you about. We have 15 minutes, I hope, for you to tell me what's on your minds and how this strikes you. Thank you very much. Do I need water? Do I need water? Did I get some water? So just introduce yourself maybe by department if you have a comment, disagreement. Well,
we met before, right?
Yes, we met before.
I was thinking about your tier here, and I'm thinking of, there are some courses and I found myself thinking about, I just wanted to get to utilitarian. I just wanted to get them put it down. I got checked off.
You're talking about yourself when you were an undergraduate.
And then I was thinking about, even as an early learner, some of the areas that I just I wanted to get deeper. I wanted to know sort of the meaning of life, if you will, than something like that.
Sure.
And so how capable are we generally as people to sort of switching modes, and should you subject me to the deeper thought provoking when I just...
When it's not your thing. It's a very good question. I mean, you get something like this, and the teacher says, well, how am I supposed to meet the needs of all of these people? And I think it's selective, and particularly in assignments, because the assignment is where the individual is coming into contact with the subject. So if you allowed an extra assignment or a substitute assignment, and that includes exams, that there could be an extra points question for people who have thought along these lines. That's one way not to cheat the other tiers out of it. In a very large university, one could have separate classes. Thank you very much. But, you're right. You put your hand on it. There was a period where...
Because most of us as professors, right, I mean, certainly in engineering or sciences, we thrive in sort of the lecture, 3 problems a day.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I don't know what to do.
Green paper, you folded it over, your name was on the outside, I'm looking over it, like engineering. We must have thrived on that because we survived very well and got the top grade where we would have...
Well, the reason you survived also is the teacher was rewarding that behavior.
Exactly right.
So now what we're talking about is opening up the process so that more people can get to the point of surviving on the pure beauty and utility of the science. Here's a teacher, so of math, my collaborator.
I have another thought on how to deal with it. I really engage with some of this in my math classes. And I think group work and peer instruction is a great way to do this. And you can do it, and there's 2 different ways of doing it if you look at the peer structure. You can group people within each tier, since you know the students well enough. But I think what's more interesting is to take people from multiple tiers. Maybe make a group of 3 where one person's in the utilitarian tier and one person in the second tier and one in the first, and then craft stuff for them to work on where each of those different perspectives has value.
Because it's important, too, for the utilitarian or the first tier to appreciate there are different kind of people out there who are users of science, who are going to make judgments about science, ecological, political judgments, and the capacity to persuade them is important. I participate actively in a big master's program around the country called the Professional Science Masters, where we take science and math majors and we give them a 2-year master's degree that's more of the science and math that they know, a little more of an ancillary science, that's nearby and related, and business fundamentals, regulatory affairs, communication, and the like, preparing them for jobs in business and industry, and in that PSM, we call it the Professional Science Masters, we find that it is necessary to teach them communication. Typical assignment would be for such a master's candidate to give a talk about a discovery, a scientific discovery that might have applications, say in the pharmaceutical world, to 3 different audiences. To the peer, who knows as much chemistry as she does, to a group of journalists who don't know very much science but are interested in the business applications, and you're going to have to avoid some of the jargon, and the third to a group of opponents, political people who don't like what you're doing, like Monsanto, genetically engineered seeds. And it's a very good exercise for a science student to realize that talking to people who didn't like science from the get-go, but who are holding power is very important. So this communication is once they identify, just so long as they don't become stereotyped. I mean, that would be a misuse of this analysis, would be to have somebody walking around with a T-shirt that says, I'm first here, who are you?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, she was a lot about the professional science masters. Any of you who are interested in making a conversation about professional science, so please come to my office. Because she is one of the inventors of that program. There are 0 programs that take in money.
And there are 300 around the country. No, we have 4 in Australia. We don't count them. Not international. Yeah, I'll be there. So let's talk more about teaching, learning from those of you who are facing those students every day. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
And freshman class, if you understand the range of the year.
And what's the field? Yeah.
So then I had a very small 10 class where we're going to just go through big questions about cancer. We weren't going to do high-end molecular stuff. And so we read Robert Weinberg's One Random Little Cell. And I had, remember, 10 students ranging from freshman to senior, all majored in science, but probably more towards the first year, because, you know, they were all fairly successful students. And I just said, write down, summarize the chapter, write 5 vocabulary words that were new to you and look them up. And it wasn't just the jargon words that showed up on my results. It was words that came from just some basic English vocabulary. So I think sometimes when we presume a level of vocabulary that's not even in our field, we can lose students. And so I just wonder if you have any.
Well, we know why they don't have vocabulary, because they're not reading anymore. So I can't fix that one. But surely, if there's an interactive classroom, let me say it this way, you'll pick up pretty quickly that everybody misunderstood a word, won't you? Because there'll be this, confusion. So the degree to which you can engage them in interaction. I've sat in on a lot of science classes at the invitation of the professor, and they've asked me for, comments. And one thing I've often missed in those classes that we do in my field, political science, is after presenting a very complex set of principles or facts, that in our class we'll stand back from the board or whatever we're using and say, if I were looking at this for the first time, I'd be wondering. Now, what am I talking about? I mean, we put ourselves in the mind of a first-time learner. It takes some imagination, but it's not impossible. If I were looking at this for the first time, I'd be wondering why what is that, or why that works, or why we're learning this now, why we didn't learn this before. And that's what my second-year people were doing in their journals. They were just asking really interesting questions, but the professor's idea of a question posing is standing, as I just did 5 minutes ago, and saying, do you have any questions, students? The professor needs to get into the other side and ask some questions, as if he or she were seeing this for the first time. Because they don't have vocabulary, they can't formulate questions, but they'll recognize a question that is theirs if you formulate it. So that's a simple thing to try, is to just stop at some point, let's digest this, and then go to the back of the room where the students are, look at the blackboard. You'll see something that you'll recognize is more complex or anomalous, that doesn't really make sense, or contradicts something you had last week. I mean, all of us are good at that. When we read papers, we notice what's wrong, what's missing. So looking at the board and just pretend you're learning this for the first time and say, what's wrong. Well, you're my side. What about somebody else out there? Yes.
Apparent change in sort of what we're seeing going from college transition to the not only what are now here
Mm-hmm.
but they're also transitioning from a different methodology of learning, just classes for 45 minutes a day, less structured, less social structured, and how that impacts the classroom.
Well, it's part of our job as first-year teachers to re-socialize them. I mean, part of it is fun for them. I mean, it's getting out of childhood and into the real world, isn't it? It's also challenging. But if we look upon it as an opportunity to teach them how to learn in a less structured way, because as they go off into the job market, they're going to be learning. If they're going to be professionals, they're going to have to keep learning, and they're going to have to learn in inchoate ways. It's not going to be a lesson. It's going to be picking things up and learning from other people, learning in meetings, learning as a team. So anything we can do to tell them or reward them and say, you're no longer in high school where you're being spoon-fed. You're now in an environment more like the world of work, where you're going to have to be, we're going to assist. We're not yet in the work world, we're still in college, but you won't be spoon-fed. You've got to look for things on your own and be more self-directed and self-motivated. And that's part of, they're discovering that in their own life. They're driving a car now, they're not being driven by mom, and in the same manner, they're driving this car toward, comprehension. I would present it as a plus, it's an opportunity to be much more in control of your learning than you were allowed to be back there. I found high school really quite oppressive, speaking personally, because I had a kind of mind that was really eager to go in all sorts of directions, and college was a joy, a dream. I used to keep 2 sets of notes. Draw a line down. Don't forget, I went to a lot of lecture classes. So I did politics and history, and I drew a line right down the middle. And on one side, took down notes from the lecture, and on the other side, took down thoughts, my observations, what I noticed. I call them notices, what I was noticing. And I can assure you, as a writer and as a grown-up intellectual, noticing is the source of, creativity. And there was no way to do that in high school, not in Yonkers High School back in the 1950s. Yeah.
So the way you describe IQ and OQ,
yeah.
I think you'll find the science professors and engineering professors really value creativity and initiative too, because they know that's where the ideas come from. How can they help their students develop this OQ?
No. Which one do you mean? The obedience quotient. I didn't think you meant that. Yeah.
The creativity quotient.
Yeah, the creative. Well, I think it's easy. It's assignments and exams. Assignments and exams, and then feedback. If a student asks a question that maybe some of the other students in the class go, because it's, you give credit. You say, that's an interesting question. We won't get to that until chapter 16. But that's an interesting, or better yet, that's a question that motivated, some historical scientists to set up an experiment. Yeah. Yes.
When I first taught my first class, it was mine. I was creating something mine. I gave lots of open-ended questions. And I hated it.
They hated it.
No, I hated it.
Oh, you hated it.
I hated it.
You had to read them.
It was a big lesson for me on, geez, I didn't need that, I wanted this, and it just was so hard to control and to get back what I really was looking for. So then and it was also a huge class.
Yeah.
Huge. So after 3 days of reading really bad questions and answers, and I fully accept my questions were bad, I decided I was going to invest my time in really creative multiple choice questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked really, really hard on it, and I thought my questions were not, well, it can't be that, can't be that, can't be that, must be this, that they had to think them through. And a student came up to me and said, yeah, Dr. A, I don't like your exam. And I was like, why is that? And they said, because it's as if you expect us to learn this stuff.
Well, there's a misunderstanding.
And I thought, well, why are you here? Wait a minute. So not everyone in college is here to learn? and I think that was my first time learning that who I was teaching was not
first year.
That they were not people who were determined above all else to get an A. They were not determined to understand it fully so they could explain it. They were not me.
Mm-hmm.
And I found I had to start to learn who these people were,
That's a good
what their motivations were. And I really love science so much. I want them to love science, and I wanted to figure out how to do it. But the first lesson was, I'm not teaching me, and every once in a while I go, oh, there's our name.
Yeah.
There she is. Yeah. She's going to be a pain in my butt, that's going to demand an A.
Well, demand, not an A, but a demand understanding and demand more from you. But I think that is the challenge. That is the challenge, is that we are thrust into positions where we're with people whom we would not only aren't like, but we might not even have spent any time with when we were young, and that's the challenge. But all the while realizing that at that age, they're still so malleable that there's a possibility that somebody, a spark will, be created, and they will suddenly appear at your door and say, what else can I read about this? Every one of our second-tier students who were being paid to do this experiment got very much more positive about science after going through intro physics and intro chemistry, because the stuff, apart from the teacher, the stuff was so engaging. It was so exciting to learn this, to how the world works, basically, for them. And they were very grateful. They didn't give me my $1,000 back, but they were grateful. I think we may have to stop soon. Anybody wants to stay a few more minutes, I can see you up here. But I want to thank you for coming, and thank you. And I guess these books are for them to take, not overtake.
Thank you very much, Sheila. The books that are sitting on the table are for you to take. And there are more.